He sat beside his crying infant, hopeless. Until a stranger showed unexpected kindness, the house was quiet, except for the constant sound of his baby's cries. It was a deep, heart-wrenching wail that pierced through the stillness of the night. The father sat on the edge of the sofa, holding his infant in his arms, staring down at the little face that was scrunched up in distress. His chest tightened with every sob, and his mind raced with thoughts that only made him feel more overwhelmed. He had always dreamed of becoming a father. He had imagined the joy, the laughter, and the special moments he would share with his child. But nothing in those dreams had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the sleepless nights, the uncertainty, or the helplessness that he felt now. He had tried everything he knew, rocking, patting, humming, but nothing seemed to work. The baby's cries only grew louder, as if they were echoing his own sense of failure. The night had started like any other. The baby had been fed, the diaper had been changed, and everything seemed fine. But then the crying began. At first, it had been quiet, just a soft whimper, almost as if the baby was trying to say something but couldn't find the words. But now, it had escalated into a full-blown cry, a sound that seemed to drain all his energy with each passing second. He tried pacing the room, gently rocking the baby in his arms, hoping that the soothing motion would calm the child down. But the crying continued, relentless and deafening. His thoughts raced, and with each failed attempt to calm his infant, his frustration grew. Was he doing something wrong? Did he not understand what his baby needed? Was he really cut out for this? The father glanced at the clock on the wall. It was well past midnight, and he was exhausted. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in the past few days, not since his baby had been born. The sleepless nights had become a blur of feeding schedules, diaper changes, and constant worry. But it was moments like this, when the baby cried and nothing seemed to help, that made him feel like he was failing at the one thing that mattered most. He knew he should be patient, that all babies cried, and that it was a normal part of growing up. But it was hard to remember that in the middle of the chaos. The baby's cries felt like a weight on his chest, pulling him down deeper into a pit of frustration and self-doubt. He tried to hush the baby with soft words, but even his own voice sounded distant and weak to him now. He had nothing left, nothing that could comfort this little one who seemed so fragile in his arms. With every sob, the father felt his own confidence slipping away. He had no experience with babies. This was his first child, and he had no idea what he was doing. Sure, he had read the books, attended the parenting classes, and listened to all the advice from family and friends, but none of it seemed to matter now. It felt like the more he tried, the worse things got. His mind wandered to his partner. She had been there at the birth, and she had a natural calmness about her when it came to the baby. She always seemed to know exactly what to do. He admired her for that, but right now she was away and he was on his own. He couldn't call her for help. She was busy with something important, and he didn't want to burden her. Besides, he felt like he should be able to handle this on his own. After all, wasn't that what fathers were supposed to do? As the minutes stretched on, his thoughts became more frantic. What if something was wrong with the baby? What if the crying was a sign of pain or hunger or something he had missed? He checked the baby's temperature, worried that the child might be sick. But the little one felt warm, not feverish, and the diaper was dry. Everything seemed fine, but the cries were unrelenting. His arms ached from holding the baby, but he couldn't put the child down. He couldn't let the crying go on without trying to comfort the baby. He felt like he was trapped in a cycle that he couldn't escape. Every time he thought he was close to soothing the baby, the cries would start up again, louder and more desperate. His frustration reached its peak, and for a moment he just sat there, holding the baby in his arms, not knowing what to do. The weight of the responsibility felt crushing. This tiny person depended on him for everything, and he couldn't even make the crying stop. The self-doubt that had been creeping in over the past few days now overwhelmed him. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for the exhaustion, the confusion, or the constant worry. He had never imagined it would be this hard. He let out a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his heart was racing. He glanced around the room, trying to find something that could help, some solution he hadn't thought of yet, but everything seemed to blur together. The walls seemed to close in, and the baby's cries became deafening. It felt like he was drowning in this moment, and no matter what he did, he couldn't seem to get his head above water. In that moment of hopelessness, he couldn't help but wonder, was this how it was going to be? Was fatherhood just a series of sleepless nights and unanswered cries? Would he always feel like he was barely keeping his head above water? He shook his head, trying to clear the negative thoughts from his mind, but they kept coming back, louder than ever. His hands were trembling as he cradled the baby, and he felt a deep, gnawing sense of failure. The baby had stopped crying for a moment, and the father thought maybe, just maybe, he had succeeded in calming the little one. But the silence was short-lived. The crying started again, even louder now, as if it was mocking him. He tried again. He rocked the baby gently in his arms, hoping that the movement would ease the child's discomfort. But the cries only grew more desperate. He felt helpless, powerless. The baby's cries felt like a reflection of his own inner turmoil. The harder he tried to make it stop, the worse it seemed to get. He wanted to scream, to break down, but he couldn't, not in front of his baby. He couldn't let the child see how lost and unsure he felt. He had to stay strong, but as the minutes stretched into hours, it became harder and harder to hold it together. He sat there, completely drained, watching the baby cry, wishing for someone, anyone, to come to his rescue. The house was dark, and the night felt like it was never going to end. The father felt like he was in a nightmare, one that he couldn't wake up from. He had never felt more alone, even though he was holding his child in his arms. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep going. As the baby's cries continued, the father's mind wandered, lost in a haze of exhaustion and self-doubt. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would change everything. The moment when a simple act of kindness would turn everything around. The clock on the wall ticked louder with each passing second. The baby's cries were still echoing in the small, quiet room. Each wail seemed to stretch longer than the last, and with every shriek, the father felt his exhaustion building. His arms ached from holding the baby, but he couldn't put the child down. The room felt like it was closing in around him, the walls pressing in as the weight of the moment seemed to become too much to bear. He glanced down at the baby in his arms. The little face was flushed with frustration, tiny hands clenched into fists, and the cries had become more intense, more desperate. It was as if the baby couldn't understand why the world around him wasn't cooperating. The father gently rocked the baby back and forth, trying to soothe the child, but the baby only screamed louder in response. "Why won't you stop?" he whispered to himself. His voice cracked and he quickly cleared his throat, but it was no use. The desperation in his voice was real. He had never felt so powerless in his life. For a moment, the baby stopped crying. The father took a deep breath, hoping that the silence meant the storm had passed. He dared to believe that he had somehow fixed it, that everything was going to be okay. But then, as if on cue, the wails started again, louder and more insistent this time. It was like the baby was asking him, begging him for something, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't give it to him. The father's heart sank. He looked at the baby, trying to understand what was wrong. He checked the baby's temperature again, hoping that the warmth wasn't a sign of sickness. But the baby felt fine. No fever, no chills, nothing that could explain the relentless crying. He checked the diaper again. Dry. He had fed the baby just an hour ago, so hunger didn't seem to be the issue. What could it be? He placed his hand gently on the baby's back, trying to comfort him, but it was like the child couldn't even hear his touch. The baby was too upset, too overwhelmed by whatever was going on inside of him. The father, once so sure of his abilities, was now left questioning himself. Was he doing something wrong? Was it his fault the baby couldn't calm down? He could feel the tears starting to sting his own eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. He had to be strong for his child. He had to figure this out. But what if he could? What if he was failing as a father? The thought hit him like a ton of bricks, and he suddenly felt very small. He thought about all the people who had told him that fatherhood would be challenging, that there would be moments of frustration. But this felt like something much bigger. He felt completely helpless, like he was failing the one person who depended on him the most. Every passing minute seemed to drag on, making him feel more and more desperate. He paced around the living room, baby still in his arms, trying to comfort him. The baby's cries echoed in his ears, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. The father tried every trick he had been taught in the parenting books and classes, but nothing seemed to work. He gently rocked the baby, murmured softly to him, tried humming a lullaby, but the baby only cried harder. The father felt the pressure building inside him, like a balloon that was about to burst. His body was exhausted. His mind was exhausted. He had reached the point where his patience was running thin, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep up the act of calmness. He just wanted the baby to stop crying. He just wanted peace. But the crying didn't stop. He looked at the clock again, counting the seconds. It felt like hours had passed, and yet nothing had changed. He felt like he had tried everything. He had done everything right, or at least he thought he had. Why was this happening? His mind began to race. Was it something he missed? Was there something wrong with his baby that he couldn't see? Was this his fault? He thought about calling his partner, but then remembered she was at work and he didn't want to worry her. She would probably tell him that this was just part of being a parent, that it would pass, and that he just had to be patient. But he was so tired, so incredibly tired. His body ached and his mind felt like it was spinning. Every time the baby cried, he felt like he was losing a piece of himself. The room felt stifling, the air thick with frustration. He glanced at the baby, whose face was now red with exertion, his tiny body trembling with each sob. The father's chest tightened. It hurt to see the baby so upset, and the fact that he couldn't do anything to help made it even worse. Why can't I fix this? He thought. He tried to shake the feeling of inadequacy, but it clung to him like a weight. He had always been able to handle tough situations. He had faced challenges in his life, worked hard and pushed through. But this was different. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with hard work or perseverance. This was about something much more delicate, much more fragile. This was about a little life that depended on him for everything, and right now, he felt like he was failing. The baby's cries seemed to be getting louder, almost like they were taunting him. He couldn't get away from them. His ears rang with the sound, and he was starting to feel dizzy. He sat back down on the sofa, holding the baby close, but even the warmth of his tiny body against his chest didn't seem to bring him comfort anymore. It felt like everything he was doing was in vain. The frustration boiled up inside of him, and he let out a frustrated sigh. He looked down at the baby, who was still crying, tears streaming down his own face now as well. His tears were not just for his baby, but for himself, for the way he felt completely powerless in this moment. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. But right now, he just felt lost. And that was a feeling he wasn't sure how to fight. As the minutes dragged on, the father continued to hold the baby, gently rocking him, whispering soft words of comfort. But deep down, he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that no matter what he did, it wasn't going to be enough. The crying continued, and with it, the father's sense of helplessness only grew stronger. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute feeling like an eternity. The baby's cries had not stopped. In fact, they seemed to be getting louder, more frantic. The father, now sitting on the couch, felt completely drained. His head was heavy, his thoughts scattered, and he was beginning to wonder if he could last through another hour of this. He had never imagined parenthood would feel this isolating. Even though he was physically holding his baby, he couldn't shake the feeling of being alone, as if the weight of responsibility had wrapped itself around him like a chain he couldn't escape. The clock on the wall seemed to mock him, its ticking growing louder in the silence between the cries. He looked down at the baby, whose face was flushed red, and the tears continued to fall, soaking into the father's shirt. He had tried everything, the rocking, the soothing voice, the gentle pats, but nothing worked. His mind was running on empty, and his patience had worn thin. As the minutes dragged on, he became increasingly desperate. The baby's cries seemed endless, and the father's confidence was fading faster than he could have ever imagined. He felt like a failure, unable to do the one thing that he had promised to do for his child, to protect and comfort him. He had always been a problem solver, someone who found solutions to every challenge. But this wasn't something that could be solved with a clever answer or a quick fix. This was raw, unrelenting emotion, and he had no idea how to navigate it. And then, just as the father was beginning to sink into a sense of despair, there was a knock at the door. The sound was faint at first, barely rising above the noise of the baby's cries. But as the baby's wails continued, the knock came again, this time louder, more urgent. The father, still holding the crying infant in his arms, felt a flash of irritation. Who could be at the door at this hour? It was nearly 2 in the morning, and he couldn't imagine anyone would be dropping by for a visit at such a late hour. But the knock came again, this time more insistent, and the father felt a strange sense of curiosity stir within him. He wasn't sure what to do. He had no energy to greet a visitor, especially not someone who was knocking so insistently in the middle of the night. But then again, he thought, maybe someone could help. Maybe they had advice, or better yet, they could take the baby for a few minutes so he could gather his thoughts. With one last glance at the baby, he stood up, slowly making his way toward the door. His feet felt heavy, his body sluggish from exhaustion. He reached for the doorknob, opened the door, and found a woman standing on the other side. She was in her late 30s, wearing a long coat and scarf, her face kind but worn, as though she had been up for hours. She had a kind expression on her face, but what caught the father off guard was the fact that she was holding a small, white bag in her hand. The woman smiled gently at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "I heard your baby crying," she said softly. "I'm a nurse who lives just down the street. I know how overwhelming it can be to care for a newborn, especially when they won't stop crying." The father blinked, stunned. He wasn't sure what to make of this woman standing on his doorstep at such an ungodly hour. He hadn't expected help, let alone from a stranger, but something in her voice, something in her calm demeanor, made him hesitate. He had been so lost in his own exhaustion that he hadn't even considered that someone might offer help. He stepped back from the door, a mix of confusion and relief flooding him. The woman didn't wait for an invitation. With a warmth that seemed to put the father at ease, she stepped inside. "I know it's tough," she said, glancing down at the baby in his arms. "Is it okay if I hold him for a minute? Sometimes a different touch can help calm a crying baby." The father nodded, unsure of what else to do. He handed her the baby, his arms trembling as he let go. The woman took the baby gently, cradling him in her arms as though she had done it 1,000 times before. For a moment, the father just stood there, watching in disbelief as the woman expertly rocked the baby, speaking softly to him in a calming tone. The crying didn't stop immediately, but the woman's soothing voice seemed to make a difference. The baby's cries became less frantic, and his body slowly relaxed against her. The father stood off to the side, feeling an unfamiliar sense of relief wash over him. He watched as the woman continued to rock the baby, her movements smooth and steady. There, the woman murmured. I know, it's hard being so little, isn't it? But you're safe now." The father, though still exhausted, could hardly believe his eyes. It was as if the baby was responding to the woman's presence, to her calmness. He felt a sense of gratitude that was overwhelming, but also a little bit of embarrassment. Why hadn't he thought of this sooner? Why hadn't he been able to calm the baby the way this stranger had? The woman continued to hold the baby, her arms cradling him with a tenderness the father hadn't seen before. She didn't seem rushed, didn't seem bothered by the cries, as if she had been in this situation 100 times. The father felt a strange sense of relief in watching her, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, there were things he didn't know yet. Maybe he wasn't meant to have all the answers right now. "Babies cry," the woman said, as if reading his thoughts. "They cry for many reasons. Sometimes it's just because they need to feel comforted, to feel safe. And sometimes they cry because they can't express themselves any other way. But that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means you're learning together." The words struck a chord with him. The idea that it wasn't his fault, that he wasn't failing, was something he hadn't even considered. He had been so focused on the idea that he should have all the answers, that he was failing, that he hadn't stopped to think about the fact that parenting was a process. It was something you learned over time, not something you got perfect right away. The baby's cries softened even more, until, finally, the room fell into a deep, peaceful silence. The father looked at the baby, now asleep in the woman's arms, and felt a weight lift off his chest. He hadn't realized how tense he had been, how much anxiety had been building up inside him until this moment of peace. The woman smiled at him, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. "See," she said, "it's not so bad once you know what works. Every baby is different, and sometimes it just takes a little time to find the right rhythm." With that, she gently handed the baby back to the father, who took the child in his arms, feeling the weight of the little body against his chest. For the first time that night, he felt a sense of calm. Maybe everything wasn't as bad as it had seemed. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he had thought. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. The woman nodded. "You're welcome. You're doing fine. Just remember, it's okay to ask for help when you need it. We all need a hand sometimes." And with that, she left, disappearing into the night as quietly as she had arrived. The father stood there in the doorway, holding his baby close, feeling a profound sense of relief and understanding. Sometimes, it wasn't about doing everything perfectly. Sometimes, it was about accepting that you couldn't do it all on your own, and that, in itself, was okay. The night had finally quieted down. The baby, once wailing uncontrollably, now slept peacefully in the father's arms, his small body rising and falling with each breath. The father, holding his infant close, sat back down on the couch, his heart still racing from the overwhelming experience. It felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. He could hardly believe that just an hour ago, he had been at the brink of despair, struggling to calm his child, unsure of what to do next. Now everything was still, the only sound the soft breathing of his baby as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. The warmth of the little body in his arms was comforting, and for the first time that night, the father felt a deep sense of peace. He had been so focused on the cries, so consumed by his feelings of failure and inadequacy, that he hadn't stopped to appreciate the small moments. The simple act of holding his baby, of just being there, was something he had been too overwhelmed to notice before. He ran his fingers gently through the baby's soft hair, marveling at the way the little one had finally calmed down. As he sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, the father couldn't help but think about the stranger who had shown up at his door. Her kindness had been nothing short of miraculous. He didn't even know her name, yet she had arrived when he was at his most desperate and offered him a solution he hadn't even considered. Her calm, reassuring presence had been exactly what he and his baby needed, and without her, he wasn't sure how he would have made it through the night. The father thought about how different things had felt just a few hours ago. He had felt completely alone, as if he were stuck in a dark room with no way out. The endless crying, the feeling of helplessness, had made him question his own abilities as a father. He had been so focused on fixing everything, on making everything perfect, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. His baby didn't need a perfect father. He just needed someone who was there, someone who would hold him and comfort him when he needed it most. He thought back to the moment when the woman had taken the baby from his arms and rocked him so gently, so confidently. How had she known exactly what to do? It wasn't magic, he realized. It was experience, calmness, and an understanding that babies don't need perfection. They need love and patience, and sometimes, just a little help from a stranger when you're at your most vulnerable. The father's mind wandered to his partner, who had always seemed so sure of herself in these situations. She was calm, composed, and she knew exactly what to do when the baby cried. He admired her for it, but he hadn't realized until now that it wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about always having the answers. It was about being present, about showing up even when you didn't know what was coming next. And that was something he had been missing. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the woman who had helped him. She had reminded him that there was no shame in asking for help, no shame in not having all the answers. Fatherhood wasn't a test of his ability to do everything perfectly. It was a journey of learning and growing, of discovering what worked and what didn't, of being flexible and patient with himself. And in that moment, he realized he had been holding himself to an impossible standard. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be there for his child, just as he had been when the baby had fallen asleep in his arms. The father's chest swelled with pride as he looked down at the sleeping infant. It wasn't the first time he had felt love for his child, but it was the first time he had truly understood the depth of that love. It wasn't just about providing for the baby's needs or making sure everything was in place. It was about being present in those moments of difficulty, of frustration, and of exhaustion. It was about staying calm, even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. He thought back to the earlier part of the night, when he had been on the edge of tears himself. It had been so easy to think that he wasn't enough, that he wasn't cut out for this responsibility. But now, as he sat there with his baby in his arms, he realized that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, about trying his best, and about learning from each experience. The silence in the room was comforting now. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed like a distant memory, and the baby's soft breathing filled the space between them. For the first time in hours, the father felt at peace. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of contentment. He knew there would be more sleepless nights, more challenges ahead, but he also knew that he wasn't alone in this. He had his baby, and he had the strength to keep going, even when things got tough. As he sat there, the father realized that this was what parenting was all about, not the perfect moments, but the imperfect ones. The ones where you didn't know what you were doing, where you felt completely lost and unsure, but you kept going anyway. And through it all, you learned, you grew, and you loved more deeply than you ever thought possible. He glanced down at the baby again, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this moment of calm. It wasn't just the baby who had been comforted tonight. It was him, too. He had learned that it was okay to ask for help, that it was okay to not have all the answers, and that it was okay to feel overwhelmed. What mattered most was the love he had for his child and the desire to be the best father he could be. The baby stirred slightly in his arms, and the father gently adjusted his hold, careful not to wake him. He leaned back against the couch, letting out a long, slow breath. Everything felt right now. The chaos, the tears, the frustration, it all seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the quiet peace that filled the room. The father didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He would always show up for his child, no matter what. As the baby slept soundly in his arms, the father closed his eyes, allowing himself to finally relax. The journey of parenthood had just begun, and he knew there would be many more challenges ahead. But for now, he was content, and that in itself was enough. The quiet of the room settled like a soft blanket over the father. The baby, now deeply asleep in his arms, seemed so peaceful, so calm. It was almost unbelievable how much had changed in just a few hours. Only earlier, he had been on the verge of breaking, consumed by the noise of the crying and the overwhelming weight of the responsibility. But now, everything was different. The house, once filled with the echoes of his frustration, was peaceful, the only sound being the soft rhythm of the baby's breath as he slept soundly. For the first time that night, the father realized something important. He wasn't alone. Not in the way he had thought, not in the way he had felt when he was sitting there, wondering how much longer he could go on. He had thought that parenting was something he had to do all by himself, that he had to be strong, never showing weakness or doubt. But that wasn't true. He had learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. It was okay to rely on others, to accept kindness when it was offered. He didn't have to carry the burden alone, and most importantly, he didn't have to be perfect. As he sat there, the baby nestled in his arms, the father felt a sense of calm he had never experienced before. He looked down at his child, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't been sure he could do this, that he could be a good father. The doubt, the fear, had been so overwhelming that he had nearly given in to the idea that he wasn't cut out for it. But now, after everything that had happened, he knew he was capable of much more than he had realized. He wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. What mattered was his commitment to being there for his child, no matter how hard it got. The father had learned an important lesson that night, that it wasn't the perfect moments that define parenthood, but the imperfect ones. The moments of struggle, of uncertainty, of fear, were just as important as the moments of joy and peace. In fact, those difficult moments were the ones that shaped him the most. They had helped him grow, made him realize that being a parent wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing up, about trying his best, about being present, even when things weren't going the way he had planned. He thought back to the woman who had knocked on his door earlier, the stranger who had offered help without hesitation. It was almost surreal to think about. He hadn't known her, and yet, in that one simple act of kindness, she had changed everything for him. She had shown him that it was okay to ask for help, that it was okay to not have all the answers, and that sometimes, all it took was a little kindness to make the world seem like a much less lonely place. He had been so focused on his own struggles that he hadn't realized how much he needed the support of others. The woman had given him not just practical advice, but also a much-needed reminder that he wasn't alone in this journey. Now, as he sat there with his baby, the father felt a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't just for the woman who had helped him, but for the baby, for the experience, and for everything he had learned. He had faced his fears, his doubts, and come out the other side stronger, more confident in his role as a father. He didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need to. He knew now that it was okay to make mistakes, to learn as he went, and to ask for help when he needed it. Parenthood was a journey, not a destination, and there was no right way to do it, only the way that worked for him and his child. The father looked around the room, taking in the quiet peace. The baby's room, which had once felt like a place of overwhelming responsibility, now felt like a sanctuary, a place of comfort and security. He knew the challenges weren't over. There would be more sleepless nights, more moments of doubt, but now he felt ready for them. He felt like he could face anything because he had learned that he didn't have to face it alone. He had his baby and he had his strength, and that was enough. As the minutes passed, he sat there, feeling the baby's tiny heartbeat against his chest, a calmness settling over him. He realized how much he had grown, how much he had learned in such a short time. It wasn't just about taking care of a baby. It was about taking care of himself, about allowing himself to be vulnerable, and about accepting that he was doing the best he could. The room was still, and in that stillness the father felt a sense of peace that he hadn't thought possible. He had been so afraid of failing, so consumed by the fear of not being enough. But now, in this quiet moment, he knew he was more than enough. He was doing exactly what he needed to do. He was being a good father, not because he was perfect, but because he loved his child with all his heart. The baby stirred slightly in his arms, and the father smiled, brushing a lock of hair away from the baby's face. The bond between them, which had been there all along, felt even stronger now. It was a bond built on love, patience, and the understanding that they were both learning together, growing together. The father wasn't just teaching his child, he was learning from him as well. As the baby slept peacefully, the father thought about the future. He didn't know what it would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid. He was ready for whatever came next, because he knew that he wasn't alone. He had his baby, and he had the strength to face anything that came his way. Together, they would navigate this journey of parenthood, learning, growing, and loving with each passing day. With a deep sigh of contentment, the father leaned back against the couch, the baby still nestled in his arms. He felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known was possible just hours earlier. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beautiful moment in the middle of it. A moment where he had learned the most important lesson of all, that it was okay to not have all the answers, to ask for help, and to simply be present for the ones you love. The father smiled softly, his heart full. He was ready for the road ahead, no matter how winding it might be. Because now he knew with absolute certainty that he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference.